The air inside Carnegie Hall was thick with a special kind of silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, buzzing with the anticipation of thousands of people holding their breath. The velvet seats seemed to hug the patrons. The gold leaf on the ceilings glittered under the soft lights, and all eyes were fixed on the stage. At the center of it all, bathed in a single, warm spotlight, sat a grand piano, its black polished surface reflecting the room like a dark, still lake. Then, a young man walked out from the wings. He was thin, almost fragile-looking, in a simple black suit that seemed a size too big for him. His name was Julian, and to the world, he was magic. He didn't wave or acknowledge the thunderous applause that greeted him. He simply sat on the bench, adjusted his position with a quiet, deliberate motion, and placed his long, pale fingers on the ivory keys. For a moment, he just sat there, his head bowed, as if in prayer. The hall fell completely silent. Then he began to play. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, No. 3. A piece so famously difficult that it was nicknamed the Ratch 3, a monster that even the most seasoned pianists feared. But for Julian, it was like breathing. The notes didn't just sound. They bloomed from the piano, filling every corner of the vast hall with a sound so powerful, so perfect it was hard to believe it was coming from a human. His fingers were a blur, a dance of impossible precision across the keys. They flew, they leaped, they caressed. The music swelled from a whisper to a roar, carrying the audience on a journey of breathtaking highs and heartbreaking lows. People in the crowd closed their eyes, letting the wash of sound carry them away. A woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man in the balcony, a well-known music critic, scribbled furiously in his notebook, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of pure awe. In the wings, standing just outside the circle of light, a man watched with an intensity that was almost frightening. This was Richard, Julian's father. He wasn't watching the keys or Julian's hands. He was watching Julian's face, or rather, the lack of expression on it. While the music poured out with enough emotion to make a stone weep, Julian's face was a mask of calm concentration. His eyes were fixed on some point in the distance, his lips a straight neutral line. To the audience, this was the look of a genius so deeply connected to his art that he was lost in another world. To Richard, it was the look of a job being done correctly. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. His own dreams of being a concert pianist had been shattered decades ago by a car accident that had left his hands stiff and sore, forever unable to handle the demands of his passion. All his ambition, all his love for the music, all his frustrated energy he had poured into his son. And now it was paying off. As the final triumphant chords of the concerto faded into the air, Richard allowed himself a small, tight smile. It was a smile of a creator, a sculptor, looking at his perfect masterpiece. The moment the last note echoed, the hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion of sound. People jumped to their feet, shouting bravo, an encore. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the old building. Julian finally looked up, a flicker of something confusion, relief, in his eyes before it was gone. He stood up and gave a small, stiff bow, then quickly walked off the stage, leaving the roaring crowd behind. Backstage, it was a controlled chaos. Reporters and photographers swarmed the small area, all trying to get a word with the young man who had just given the performance of a lifetime. Julian seemed to shrink back, overwhelmed by the noise and the flashing lights. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. Before anyone could reach him, Richard stepped in, forming a human shield in front of his son. All right, give him some space," he said, his voice loud and firm, but with a practiced, friendly charm. "The young man needs a moment." A journalist pushed a microphone forward. "Julian, that was incredible. How does it feel to be called the best pianist of your generation?" Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted to his father. Richard stepped in smoothly. He's humbled, truly humbled. It's all about the music for him. He just wants to honor the great composers, another reporter shouted. "Can you tell us about your process? How do you put so much emotion into the music?" Again, Julian hesitated, his brow furrowed slightly as if searching for an answer he didn't have. Richard's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder, a gesture that looked both comforting and possessive. "He feels it deeply," Richard explained. "He's always been a sensitive soul. He doesn't need to talk about it. He lets his fingers do the talking." He then gently steered Julian away from the crowd and toward a quiet dressing room, leaving the reporters to scribble down the father's words as if they were gospel. Sitting in the back of the pack, a woman named Clara watched the whole exchange with a thoughtful frown. She was a writer for a respected music magazine, and unlike her colleagues, she wasn't just swept up in the hype. She had seen many prodigies come and go. She had written glowing reviews herself. But there was something about Julian that bothered her. It wasn't his playing. The playing was undeniably genius. It was him. She looked down at her notepad. She had written, "Technically flawless, a perfect machine." Then she had underlined the word machine 3 times. She had also written, "No joy, no sadness, just execution." And next to that, "Father speaks for him. Always." She watched as Richard closed the dressing room door behind them, shutting out the world. It felt less like a father protecting his shy son and more like a handler securing his valuable asset. Later that night, long after the crowds had gone and the hall was dark and empty, Julian sat in a sterile white hotel room. There were no personal belongings in sight, no books, no clothes thrown over a chair. It could have been a room no one had ever stayed in. On the table was a plain, uneaten meal of chicken and broccoli, covered in plastic wrap. The only object that looked out of place was a sleek digital piano keyboard set up against the wall, complete with a pair of high-tech headphones. Richard came into the room holding 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Julian. "You were perfect tonight," he said, his voice softer now, away from the crowds. "Every note was exactly where it should be." Julian just nodded, taking a small sip of water. "They loved you," Richard continued, his eyes gleaming with pride. "They all loved you." He looked at his son, expecting a smile, some sign of happiness. But Julian's face remained blank. He just stared at the digital piano in the corner. After a few moments of silence, he put down his glass, picked up the headphones, and slipped them over his ears. His fingers found the keys, and for the next hour, in the perfect silence of the room, he played. Not with passion or fire, but with the quiet, relentless accuracy of a clockmaker ticking away the seconds. He was practicing, refining, perfecting. He was a vessel, and the night's performance had simply been the pouring out of the contents his father had put inside him. The world had called him the best, a genius, a miracle. But in the quiet of the room, with only the sound of his own flawless playing in his ears, he was just a boy playing a song he hadn't written. For a father whose dreams he was forced to live. A year had passed since the night at Carnegie Hall, and the world's love for Julian had only grown. He was no longer just a prodigy. He was an institution. His face was on magazine covers, his albums sold millions, and his concerts were sold-out events the moment tickets were released. He was a phenomenon, a quiet genius who spoke only through the keys of his piano. But with the fame, the pressure had become a heavy, invisible cloak that he wore everywhere. The demand for more music, more perfection, was constant. It was during a live television special, An Evening with Julian, that the first tiny, almost invisible crack appeared in the perfect porcelain of his public image. The TV studio was hotter than the stage of any concert hall. Bright lights beat down, making the air shimmer. Julian sat on a sleek modern stool, the camera zooming in on his hands as he finished a piece by Chopin. The performance was, as always, flawless. Every note was a pearl, perfectly round and shining. The host, a man with a practiced, toothy smile and a voice full of false warmth, applauded enthusiastically. "Incredible. Absolutely incredible, Julian. Just magnificent," he boomed, turning to the camera. "Folks, we are witnessing history. A true master." The studio audience, a hand-picked crowd of adoring fans, clapped and cheered on cue. Julian gave his customary small nod. He never seemed comfortable with this part, the talking. He lived for the music, or so the story went, but the praise seemed to bounce right off him. The host leaned in conspiratorially. You know, Julian, we all know you can play the classics like no one else. But I'm curious. I bet our audience is too. Can you just, have a little fun? Show us something spontaneous. How about a simple little blues tune? Something from the heart? The host smiled, expecting the young genius to laugh and effortlessly whip out a soulful, improvised melody. It was meant to be a charming, humanizing moment, but Julian didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just stared at the host, his eyes wide with a look that was unmistakably panic. It was the look of a student who hadn't studied for the pop quiz. His hands, which had just been flying across the keys with divine grace, now lay frozen in his lap. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity of awkward silence. The studio audience's applause died down, replaced by a confused murmur. Julian's eyes darted off camera, searching desperately. He was looking for his father. He found him. Standing just beyond the lights, Richard's face was a mask of tight control. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Richard then stepped forward, smoothly moving into the light as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He clapped the host on the back with a hearty laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, you can't just spring that on him," Richard said, his voice full of good-natured charm. "Julian is a serious artist. He pours his entire soul into preparing these magnificent pieces for you. He's not a jukebox." The audience chuckled, relieved to have the awkwardness broken. The host, a little flustered, quickly agreed. Of course. My mistake. A true artist. We respect that." Richard then turned to Julian, his hand resting firmly on his son's shoulder. "Why don't you play us the encore from the Carnegie Hall show? The one everyone loves." Julian's whole body seemed to relax. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar blank concentration. He nodded, and his fingers found the keys. The familiar, perfect notes filled the studio, and the crisis was averted. To everyone watching, it was just a brief, awkward moment. But to one person in the back of the studio, it was a revelation. That person was the journalist from the concert, Clara. She was there to write a feature story on Julian's rise to the top. She had seen the whole exchange up close. The look on Julian's face wasn't shyness. It was terror. It was the look of someone who had been asked to do something they were simply not programmed to do. A simple blues tune. It was something any decent pianist could whip up in their sleep. But the best pianist ever couldn't. And his father had swooped in to save him, not by comforting his son, but by redirecting the script. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The image of Julian's frozen hands and panicked eyes played over and over in her mind. It just didn't add up. Her investigation began quietly in the lonely hours of the night. She started by rewatching every single interview and performance of Julian she could find online. She watched with a new eye, no longer seeing a genius, but looking for a flaw. And she started to find them. In a televised concert from Paris, a fan in the front row shouted out, "Play Happy Birthday." Julian had paused mid-song, looking confused, until the conductor smoothly transitioned into the next piece on the program. In another interview, a reporter asked him what his favorite piece of music was to listen to, just for fun. He had opened his mouth, then closed it, looking at his father, who had answered for him, saying, "He doesn't listen for fun. He studies the scores. He is a scholar of the music." At the time, it sounded profound. Now, it sounded like a lie. Clara then turned her attention to the home videos that had been released as part of a documentary about his life. They were meant to show his early genius. There was 3-year-old Julian, tiny on a bench, playing a difficult batch invention. There was 6-year-old Julian, performing for a small group of family friends. But as Clara watched, a chill went down her spine. The videos were too perfect. The camera was always at the perfect angle. The lighting was soft and professional. There were no shaky moments, no shots of a toddler running away from the piano, no interruptions. It was all curated, staged. It was the home movie of a perfect product. not a real child. She needed to talk to someone who saw the real Julian, not the public one. She spent a week calling and visiting old concert halls, talking to stagehands and technicians. Most of them had nothing to say, just that he was quiet and his father was very involved. But finally, an old man who had worked as a backstage manager at a hall in London agreed to talk to her. They met in a noisy pub, and over a pint of beer, he told her a story. "I remember him well," the old man said, staring into his drink. "Never said a word. But one night, after the show, I was clearing the stage. Everyone had gone. I heard this noise coming from the piano. I went to have a look, and it was the boy. He was just tapping one key, over and over again. Not a tune. Just one note, tap, 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 like he was testing it. His father came rushing out and grabbed him by the arm, dragged him away, gave me a look that could freeze fire. I always felt sorry for the lad. Looked like a beautiful bird in a gilded cage. That was the final piece of the puzzle for Clara. The inability to improvise. The perfect staged home videos. The father's constant control. The strange, repetitive behavior. The image of him tapping a single key. It painted a picture that was both incredible and deeply disturbing. Julian wasn't a pianist. He was a mimic. A performer who had memorized, with perfect accuracy, a set list of music. He could replicate it flawlessly, but he couldn't create. He couldn't even play Happy Birthday. He was a human player piano, and his father was the one who had programmed him. The big mistake the world had made wasn't just in calling him the best. It was in believing that the beautiful music they heard was coming from his soul. Clara looked at her notes spread out on her small kitchen table. She had a theory now, a wild, almost unbelievable theory. But she knew with a certainty that settled in her bones that it was true, and she knew she had to prove it. The digital trail had gone cold. For weeks, Clara had lived in a world of pixels and data, scrolling through old articles, watching grainy videos, and following dead-end links. She had confirmed her suspicions, but she had no proof. It was all circumstantial, a collection of strange moments and odd behaviors that only made sense if you believed the impossible. She needed something real, something tangible. She needed to find the source. Her breakthrough came not from a music database, but from a property records archive. In an old interview, Richard had once mentioned owning a little place in the mountains to get away from it all. It was a throwaway line, but Clara clung to it. After hours of searching through county records under various names and business entities associated with the Crofts, she found it. A property deed for a secluded house in rural Pennsylvania, held by a shell company with a name that meant nothing. Allegheny Music Holdings. It was a long shot. But it was the only one she had. The drive from the city was a journey into another world. The concrete canyons and relentless noise gave way to rolling green hills and a silence so deep it felt like a presence. Clara followed the GPS on her phone down winding country roads, past farms with lazy cows and fields of corn that stood tall and still in the afternoon sun. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. What was she even doing? Chasing a ghost based on a hunch. She could be driving to the middle of nowhere to look at an empty house. But the image of Julian's panicked face on the television set pushed her forward. She had to know. Finally, the GPS directed her down a long, graveled driveway that was almost hidden by overgrown trees. The house at the end of it wasn't a mansion or a lavish estate. It was a simple, two-story stone house that looked like it had been there for 100 years, watching the seasons change. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no cars in the driveway, no signs of life. Clara parked her car on the side of the main road, out of sight, and walked back to the end of the driveway. She felt like an intruder, a spy. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She decided to act the part of a lost tourist, a plausible enough story in this area. She pulled out her phone, pretending to be confused, and walked slowly toward the house, her ears straining for any sound, and then she heard it. It was faint at first, so soft she thought she might be imagining it. It was the sound of a piano. But it wasn't the sound she knew from Julian's records. This was different. The notes were hesitant, sometimes stumbling over each other before finding their place. A chord would be struck, then held for a moment too long, as if the player was lost in thought. It was the sound of someone thinking out loud, using the keys to ask a question. Then a melody would emerge, not perfect and polished, but raw and searching. It was full of pauses, of little hesitations and corrections. It was the most human music she had ever heard. There was a soulfulness to it, a deep, aching sadness that was completely absent from Julian's flawless performances. This music had mistakes in it, but the mistakes were what made it beautiful. They were the fingerprints of a real person, a person with feelings and doubts. Clara stood there mesmerized, her phone forgotten in her hand. The music seemed to be telling a story of a life filled with longing and regret. It was the sound of a conversation, an argument, a prayer, all happening with the piano. She had to know who was playing. She waited until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The house grew dark, save for a single warm light that glowed from a window on the first floor. The music had stopped. Clara, driven by a determination that outweighed her fear, crept closer to the house. The world was reduced to the sound of crickets and the thumping of her own heart. She moved silently along the stone wall, staying in the shadows until she was right below the lit window. It was a large bay window, and the curtains were not fully drawn. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she slowly raised her head and peered inside. The scene inside stole her breath away. The room was cozy, filled with books and comfortable-looking furniture. And in the center of the room, bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, was a grand piano. Sitting at the piano was not Julian. It was his father, Richard. He was hunched over the keys, his shoulders slumped, his face a landscape of agony and concentration. His eyes were closed, and his hands, the hands Clara had only seen gesturing firmly or resting possessively on his son's shoulder, were moving with a passion that was almost violent. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was wrestling with them, shaping them, begging them to tell a story. His body swayed with the music, his fingers sometimes flying across the keys in a fury, then slowing to a gentle, caressing touch. The raw, emotional music she had heard earlier was pouring out of him, note by painful, beautiful note. This was the source. This was the ghost behind the machine. Richard wasn't just the teacher or the manager. He was the artist. He was the true genius. Clara watched, transfixed, as Richard played. She saw the years of frustration in the tense set of his jaw. She saw the love for the music in the way his fingers gently stroked the keys after a powerful passage. And she saw the tragedy of it all. This man, who possessed such an incredible, soulful talent, was hiding away in a secluded house in the middle of nowhere, playing only for himself, while his son, a beautiful empty vessel, was out in the world, taking the bow. It all made sense now. Julian's inability to improvise, his frozen expression, his dependence on his father. He wasn't a pianist. He was a performer who had memorized with perfect photographic memory every single note his father had painstakingly composed and practiced for him. Richard had created the music, drilled it into his son's mind and hands, and then sent Julian out to be the face, the beautiful, marketable genius that the world could fall in love with. Clara slowly lowered her head and backed away from the window. Oh, her mind reeling. The drive back to the city was a blur. The story was no longer about exposing a fraud. It was about something much deeper and more tragic. It was about a father's twisted love, a desperate attempt to live his stolen dream through his son. It was about a son who had never had a chance to find his own voice. The best pianist ever was just an illusion, a beautiful, perfect mirage created in the quiet, lonely practice room of a house in the Pennsylvania hills. The real music, the music with a soul, was only ever played in secret for an audience of one. Clara knew she had her story now. She had the truth. But as she drove back toward the city lights, she felt a heavy weight settle on her. She wasn't just going to write an article. She was about to tear down a carefully constructed world and expose a family's heartbreaking secret to the entire world. Clara knew she couldn't just publish the story. An article based on a peek through a window and a hunch would be torn apart. She needed a confession, or at least a comment from Richard. She found her opportunity a few days later. Julian was scheduled for a major press conference before a series of concerts in a new city. Richard would be there, managing the narrative as always. Clara arrived early and took a seat in the back of the sterile, modern hotel conference room, watching as the event staff set up microphones and cameras. She felt a strange calm, the quiet certainty of a person who was about to change everything. Richard walked in about an hour before it was set to begin, looking sharp and in control, barking orders at the publicist. He scanned the room, his eyes pausing for a second on Clara before moving on. He recognized her, of course. He knew who all the major music journalists were. After the staff had left to get coffee, Clara saw her chance. She walked slowly toward the front of the room, not like a journalist on the attack, but like a casual observer. Richard was studying the schedule on the podium. She stopped a few feet away, giving him space. "It's quite an operation you've built," she said, her voice quiet and conversational. Richard didn't look up. "It's about giving the music the respect it deserves," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "It is," Clara agreed. "The music is truly beautiful." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then she asked the question she had been rehearsing in her mind. "I was just wondering, in all your time together, have you ever seen him just play for fun?" Richard's head snapped up. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than control in his eyes. It was a tiny crack in the armor, a flash of pure panic. "What kind of question is that?" he asked, his voice a little too sharp. "A simple one," Clara said softly, holding his gaze. "A simple blues tune on TV," and he looked terrified. Not shy, terrified. "I've watched the old videos. They're perfect. Too perfect. I found your house in Pennsylvania. I heard you play." She didn't say it as an accusation. She said it like a statement of fact, a sad and simple truth. The color drained from Richard's face. The confident, powerful man seemed to shrink right before her eyes. He looked around the empty room, as if searching for an escape route. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The facade was crumbling. "My office," he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. Now his office was a small, sterile room adjoining the main suite. The moment the door closed behind them, the dam broke. Richard didn't yell or argue. He sank into a leather chair and put his head in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. It wasn't a performance. It was the sound of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for 20 years, and it had finally crushed him. "He can't," Richard choked out, the words muffled by his hands. "He can't play for fun. He can't improvise. He can't read music. He can't do any of it." For the next hour, the whole story came pouring out of him in a torrent of words and tears. He spoke of his own dreams, of the promising career as a concert pianist that was ended by a drunk driver. He described the agony of his injury, not just the physical pain in his hands, but the spiritual pain of having the music, the very thing that made him who he was, locked inside him with no way to get out. "I was so angry," he said, staring at the wall. "So bitter. I looked at my son, this beautiful, quiet boy, and I saw a second chance. Not for him. For me," he explained how he discovered Julian's gift. "It wasn't for music, but for mimicry. Julian had an almost supernatural eidetic memory. He could hear anything once, a string of numbers, a poem, a piece of music, and repeat it back perfectly. He was a perfect vessel," Richard said, his voice hollow. "I started composing. I wrote everything. Every piece he ever played. I would practice for months, years, in that house in Pennsylvania. I would pour all my passion, all my sadness, all my love for the music into those keys. And then I would teach it to Julian, note for note, finger position for finger position. We would practice for 10, 12 hours a day. I drilled it into him until it was part of his muscle memory, until he could do it in his sleep." He looked at Clara, his eyes red and swollen. "I gave the world beauty. I gave them a genius they could believe in. And I gave my son a life of purpose and admiration. What was so wrong with that?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. The tears streamed down his face. "I stole his life. I stole his chance to find his own music. I didn't make a pianist. I made a machine. A beautiful, perfect, soulless machine. And I was the only one who knew the code." Clara's story was published online 3 days later under a simple, devastating headline, "The Ghost in the Keys." The reaction was immediate and explosive. It was like a match had been dropped on a pool of gasoline. Within hours, the story was everywhere. It was the lead item on every news broadcast. The internet went into a frenzy. Hashtags like hashtag piano fraud and hashtag JULIANS ghost were trending worldwide. People who had bought his albums and worshipped him now felt betrayed and foolish. The adoration turned to anger, and the anger turned to a digital mob. The fallout was swift and total. Sponsors, who had once paid millions to be associated with the best pianist ever, couldn't drop him fast enough. Their official statements were cold and clinical, citing a breach of trust. The world's most famous concert halls, which had his name on their marquees for years to come, quietly canceled his upcoming tours, offering refunds and vague apologies. The record label, facing the prospect of selling music created under false pretenses, filed a massive lawsuit against Richard and Julian, seeking to reclaim hundreds of millions of dollars. The empire that Richard had so carefully built was not just crumbling, it was being vaporized. In the eye of this hurricane was Julian. He was in the hotel suite when the story broke. He just sat on the couch and watched the news, his face unreadable. He saw his own face on the screen, next to the word fraud in big red letters. He watched clips of his own performances, the ones he had played with such flawless precision, now being analyzed by experts who pointed out the lack of personal interpretation and the robotic perfection. He saw the clip from the TV special. The moment he had frozen, now played over and over as the moment the lie was exposed. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just watched. Richard was in the room with him, but he might as well have been on another planet. He sat in a chair by the window, a broken man, staring out at the city below. The father and son didn't look at each other. The silence between them was heavier than any sound. It was filled with 20 years of lies, with a love that was as real as it was poisonous, with a lifetime of stolen dreams. Julian was no longer a celebrated prodigy. He was a victim, a fraud, a mystery. The world that had worshipped a lie had now discarded him. He was left alone. A young man who had played for kings and queens but had never once learned to play a simple song for himself, facing a future that was completely, terrifyingly unknown. The big mistake was complete, and the price was being paid by everyone. 5 years is a long time for the world to forget. The headlines about the piano fraud had been replaced by new scandals, new sensations. The name Julian Croft, once a symbol of perfection, was now just a footnote. A cautionary tale whispered in music conservatories about the dangers of ambition. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, strange landscape. In this new world, Julian found a job that felt both like a punishment and a sanctuary. He was a music librarian in a small, quiet corner of a vast city library. His days were spent in the company of silence and paper. The air smelled of old books and floor wax. His work was simple: 2 catalog scores to repair broken spines on collections of sonatas, to help the occasional student find a rare piece of sheet music. It was a life lived in the shadows of the music he once performed, a life where the only sound he was responsible for was the gentle rustle of turning pages. He lived alone in a modest apartment, furnished with the kind of plain, functional furniture that comes in a box. There were no gold records on the walls, no posters from old concerts. There was no grand piano taking up half the living room. The only instrument he owned was a simple, second-hand upright piano that he had bought for a few $100s from a family who was moving. For the first 2 years, he never touched it. It just sat there against the wall, a silent, dusty reminder of a life that felt like it had happened to someone else. His co-workers at the library knew who he was, of course. It was impossible not to, but they were kind enough never to mention it. They saw a quiet man who was good with his hands and knew more about music history than anyone they had ever met. They didn't see the ghost of a fraud. They just saw Julian in a different part of the city, a house that was now too big and too quiet. Richard lived a life of complete silence. The lawsuit had taken everything: the money, the house in Pennsylvania, the reputation. All he had left was a small pension and his memories. The grand piano that had been his soul's voice, the one in the Pennsylvania house, had been seized and sold. The one in his city apartment, a beautiful Steinway he had bought in his early, hopeful days, now sat under a white sheet gathering a thick layer of dust. He never played it. He couldn't. The music that had once poured out of him, full of passion and pain, was now gone. He had tried a few times in the early days, but his hands would shake and the notes that came out were hollow, empty. The joy was gone, replaced by a crushing shame. He would sit for hours just looking at the shrouded instrument, a man haunted by the ghost of his own creation. He had stolen his son's life to keep his own dream alive, and in the end, he had lost them both. The change in Julian began on a rainy Tuesday night. He was walking home from the library, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold drizzle. He passed a small, smoky jazz bar he had walked by 100 times, but never noticed. Tonight, though, a sound drifted out through the slightly open door, a sound that was different. It wasn't the flawless, perfect sound he knew. It was messy, full of energy and life. On a whim, something he hadn't felt in years, he pushed open the door and went inside. The place was dark and warm, crowded with people talking and laughing. On a small stage in the corner, a trio was playing. A man was playing the piano, his body swaying to the rhythm, a huge grin on his face. Julian watched, mesmerized. The pianist's fingers would sometimes fumble a note, or he'd hit a slightly wrong chord. But when he did, he didn't stop. He would just laugh, look over at the bassist, and weave the mistake into the next phrase, making it sound like it was supposed to be there all along. He was improvising, making the music up as he went along, telling a story with his hands that was happening right there in that moment. He wasn't replicating a masterpiece. He was creating one, flaws and all. He was having fun. Julian stood in the back of the bar for over an hour, just watching. He saw the way the pianist interacted with the audience, winking at someone who shouted out a request. He saw the pure, unadulterated joy on his face. A joy Julian had never seen on the face of any classical pianist, including himself. And in that moment, watching this man play with such happy imperfection, Julian finally understood. His father had taught him that music was about perfection, about hitting every note with absolute precision. But this man was showing him that music wasn't about perfection. It was about expression. It was about the human touch. The mistakes weren't failures. They were the fingerprints of the artist. They were the sound of a real person, with real feelings, sitting at the keys. The big mistake wasn't that the world had called him the best. The real mistake was believing that the best meant being perfect, like a machine. The best music, the truest music, was beautifully, wonderfully human. He walked home in the rain, but he didn't feel the cold. His mind was clearer than it had been in years. He thought of the thousands of hours he had spent practicing, trying to erase every possible mistake, trying to be a perfect copy of his father's vision. He thought of the silent, covered piano in his father's apartment. And he thought of the joyful, imperfect sound from the jazz bar. When he got back to his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights. He just stood in the dark, looking at the shape of his own piano against the faint light from the window. He walked over and pulled the bench out. The legs made a soft scraping sound on the wooden floor. He sat down. He lifted the lid over the keys, revealing the yellowed ivory. He placed his fingers on the keys, just as he had done 1,000,000 times before. But this time it felt different. He wasn't thinking about Rachmaninoff or his father's stern voice in his head. He was just thinking about the sound. He took a deep breath, and then he pressed a single key. The note that came out was not loud or perfect. It was a little shaky, a little uncertain. It was just a simple middle C, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Because for the first time in his life it was entirely his own.